Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for a really high-stakes investigation. It cuts right across several global flashpoints.
It really does.
We're dealing with, secretive peace talks. We're analyzing geopolitical economic warfare.
Yeah.
And exposing these critical supply chain vulnerabilities. It feels like everything is converging at once.
It's an intense confluence of strategy. It truly feels like a moment where diplomatic and military action are just inseparable from global finance and trade.
Right.
The battlefront has, it's fundamentally expanded from trenches to treasury departments.
And that's really the core of this deep dive. Our mission for you today is, well, it's a shortcut to being well-informed. We're unpacking the most sensitive details we can find from global diplomatic cables, from high-level economic statements.
And we have to cover a few different fronts here.
Exactly. Three critical interconnected fronts. First, the shocking details of this rumored U.S.-Russia draft peace plan for Ukraine. Second, the complicated and highly unstable landscape of U.S.-EU trade, especially around tariffs. And finally, the blatant, the weaponization of economic tools, whether that's frozen assets or the global supply of computer chips.
And we have to start right away with the most explosive detail. I mean, it really defines the high stakes of everything else we're about to discuss.
Okay.
Our sources confirm the existence of a highly controversial 28-point draft peace deal for Ukraine. It's reportedly circulating in, closed diplomatic circles.
Wow.
And the initial furious reaction from a lot of European leaders, it suggests this proposal is nothing less than a full-scale capitulation for Kyiv.
Okay, so let's unpack this 28-point proposal right at the top. This draft, it's not just diplomatic gossip, is it?
No, not at all.
The details have been reported by major outlets. We're talking Axios, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and it's reportedly drafted by officials from both Russia and the United States, specifically citing Kirill Dmitriev, who heads Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, and the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. That mix of finance and diplomacy it's fascinating in itself.
It absolutely is. And what's really fascinating here is that the demands being reported are, they're maximalist. The insight here might be that this document isn't a genuine peace offer.
So what is it?
It could be a highly effective piece of information warfare, designed to force President Zelenskyy into an untenable political corner, regardless of whether the U.S. even truly backs it.
So they're using diplomacy to achieve goals they couldn't win militarily. What does that tell us about their assessment of Western resolve right now?
It suggests they believe they can win in the back channels what they failed to win on the ground. The core concession demanded of Ukraine is to formally cede the rest of the Russian-occupied eastern Donbas region to Russia.
Territory they couldn't take by force.
Exactly. Territory Moscow had, until recently, been unable to conquer.
And beyond just territory, the military cuts. They sound extremely severe.
Draconian is the right word. Ukraine would have to cut its armed forces by half.
Half, wow.
Yeah. And they'd also be required to reduce or just abandon specific types of weaponry, especially any long-range missiles that could, potentially hit Russian targets.
And crucially,
And perhaps most damaging for Kyiv, the plan reportedly demands Ukraine agree to reducing or halting U.S. military assistance entirely and banning any future deployment of Western troops like that Franco-British-led coalition of the willing that's been discussed.
And the concessions aren't just military, are they? They seem to go deep into Ukraine's internal identity.
Oh, absolutely. There are serious Russification concerns here. The cultural policies reportedly require Ukraine to formally recognize Russian as an official state language.
I see.
Plus, granting formal status to the Russian Orthodox Church, which, given the context of the conflict, that adds a massive layer of political complexity.
So this raises the essential question. What does Ukraine actually get in return for all this? For giving up sovereignty, territory, control over its own military.
Well, the plan reportedly includes potential U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine against future Russian aggression. But you have to remember the history here.
The Budapest Memorandum.
Exactly. The U.S. was a key signatory to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which guaranteed Ukraine's security for giving up its nuclear arsenal. And, Russia violated that agreement.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? In geopolitics, a signed piece of paper is only as valuable as the willingness of the people who signed it to actually uphold it.
Right, and the sources are clear. The details of what these new U.S. security guarantees would even entail are completely lacking. It makes the whole offer sound fragile.
So if that's the starting point, What about the immediate diplomatic fallout?
The Ukrainian reaction has been, well, predictably strong. This proposal violates numerous Ukrainian red lines. It just repeats Moscow's maximalist demands.
It would require a humiliating U-turn from President Zelenskyy.
A huge one. He has always opposed giving up territory under duress.
And the timing couldn't be more loaded. At the same time this is leaking, Zelenskyy is meeting with top Pentagon officials in Kyiv, led by U.S. Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll.
Yeah, and the official U.S. responses, they really reflect how sensitive this all is. The White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, was extremely guarded, just said he had no news or announcements.
And the State Secretary.
Marco Rubio gave a really cryptic response on X. He said, ending a complex and deadly war requires an extensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas and difficult but necessary concessions.
That ambiguity certainly fuels speculation, doesn't it? That these high-level back channels are very active.
It does. And here's where the evidence of the drafting process gets really interesting. When the plan was first reported, the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff posted something on X.
Okay.
Below the reporter's story, he posted a message that he then quickly deleted. It looked like a private note. It said, he must have got this from K.
K, as in Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian wealth fund head.
Presumably. That kind of error is a strong indicator of collaborative involvement at a pretty high level.
Wow. And if we connect this to the wider European context,
Yeah.
what's the reaction been there?
Overwhelmingly negative. The EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, was emphatic. She stressed any plan needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board.
She drew a clear line.
A very clear line. She said there is one aggressor and one victim, and she backed that up with a damning statistic from the sources. 93% of Russian targets have been civilian infrastructure.
Schools, hospitals.
Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings. She also confirmed that European leaders were kept completely in the dark about this proposal.
And other major European voices.
They echoed that concern. The French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, insisted that peace cannot mean capitulation for Kyiv. It shows a pretty unified front against this idea of cutting a deal over Ukraine's head.
But there are divisions.
Oh, yes. We have to note the strong dissenting voice within the EU. Hungary's Peter Szijjártó. He suggested the EU should stop payments to a war mafia in Ukraine and called the idea that time is on Ukraine's side an illusion.
So while the majority opposes the plan, the bloc is still internally divided on strategy.
Exactly. Now, on a separate and very rare note of cooperation, Ukraine did report receiving the remains of about 1,000 people. Russia claimed they were killed Ukrainian soldiers in a repatriation effort.
It's a small, grim area of dialogue amid all this turmoil.
It is. And the reason this kind of diplomatic pressure can even be considered is because economic leverage is now running parallel to military power.
Right.
The cost and viability of continued support, it all hinges on economic stability and the tools the West is willing to use. And that moves us right into our next segment. The interconnected trade and financial battles shaping all of this.
Okay, let's start with that U.S.-EU trade deal friction. The sources detail a recent agreement where the U.S. and EU settled on a 15% tariff on a lot of European imports.
But a huge 50% tariff remains on steel imports.
And a new 15% duty specifically on wine and spirits.
Yeah. And what's concerning here is all the uncertainty looming over this deal. The European parliamentary process isn't likely to be finished before February. But the greater unknown is a Supreme Court ruling.
On the legality of the existing tariffs from the previous administration.
Exactly. That's expected next month or in January.
Tell us why that Supreme Court case is so crucial.
Well, it's the whole legal foundation for the current U.S. trade pressure. The Supreme Court is reviewing whether the previous administration abused national security powers, specifically Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, to impose these tariffs in the first place.
So a ruling against the administration could.
It could shatter the legal basis for many of these tariffs. It could fundamentally change the transatlantic trade balance overnight. All this uncertainty is delaying investment decisions across the board.
And meanwhile, we're seeing friction spill over into other major trade deals, specifically with the Mercosur countries like Brazil and Argentina.
Yes, there's been a lot of disinformation, or fake news as they call it, circulating in Europe about that deal.
What's the narrative been?
The perception in Europe is that this deal would poison citizens or, flood Europe with agricultural products and overwhelm EU farmers. But the Brazilian ambassador to the EU, Pedro Miguel da Costa e Silva, he really refuted this point.
How so? What was his counterargument?
He argued that half of Brazil's exports to the EU are actually non-competitive inputs. So we're talking about commodities like coffee and soy, plus essential industrial minerals, frozen orange juice.
Things the EU needs for its own industries.
Exactly. His point was that these are necessary inputs that support EU businesses. They're not sensitive to European agricultural producers who are focused on completely different products. So the debate is being waged on misperceptions.
That brings us squarely to our next segment, trade as the new geopolitical weapon. This is where the core thesis of our source material lies, that powerful insight that argues everything could be weaponized.
And trade is the new tool.
It's the new tool in this geopolitical competition. Europe's reliance on stable, reliable global supply chains is now being profoundly challenged by all these new tariffs and export controls.
And you see this dynamic most clearly in the friction over chip supply, specifically with the Dutch firm Nexperia and its Chinese parent Wingtech.
Right, the Dutch government initially imposed, say, controls on Nexperia.
They did, amid concerns about technology transfer and IP moving to China.
What's the status of that control order now, and what does it tell us about the vulnerability of that supply chain?
Well, the Dutch economy minister recently lifted the order. He called it a gesture of goodwill toward China. But Wingtech has rejected the accusations of mismanagement and is demanding the permanent rescission of the control order.
I see.
But what's critical here is Nexperia's cross-border reliance. The production process requires inputs from both the EU and China. The Netherlands produces these sensitive wafers that then have to be sent to parent plants in China for finishing. Any disruption to that chain, driven by politics, puts the entire global supply under pressure.
It just demonstrates the incredible fragility of modern manufacturing, doesn't it? And this weaponization of finance also hits Russia hard, which brings us to the leverage from frozen assets. The sources detail an explicit threat from the Russian parliament about the potential EU seizure of hundreds of billions in frozen Russian assets.
The counter threat is severe, and it's specifically targeted. The parliament stated explicitly that any seizure must be met by a claim for damages against Belgium and Euroclear.
Euroclear, the massive financial clearinghouse in Brussels.
Right, where most of the frozen assets are actually held.
So that makes Belgium the legal choke point. But what's the practical mechanism behind their second threat? To seize assets of non-residents from unfriendly countries. What are we talking about here?
Primarily, we're talking about private corporate holdings and investments held inside Russia by firms from countries designated unfriendly. That includes all EU members and the US.
So they'd seize private company assets.
Yes. They threatened to use these holdings to compensate for any losses from the West's confiscation of Russian state assets. And this legal risk that Russia would immediately retaliate with counterclaims has been the main reason for Belgium's opposition to the EU seizure measures. They fear opening up Euroclear and their own economy to massive retaliatory lawsuits.
And just to quickly touch on related security incidents here, there was that Russian rail sabotage attack over the weekend.
Right, which Germany's Merz and Poland's Tusk discussed. Poland has already requested the extradition of 2 Ukrainian citizens from Belarus who are suspected of carrying it out.
And we also saw that unfortunate Czech train crash that lacked the ETCS safety system.
Yes, and to clarify for you, the ETCS is the European Digital Signal Control System. It's designed to automatically regulate train speeds, stop trains that run red lights. It's meant to prevent these exact types of collisions.
And this mirrored a similar crash in Slovakia just a week before.
It did. It highlights these critical, ongoing infrastructure vulnerabilities across the continent.
Ultimately, the evidence is overwhelming. What the sources show us is that the global security strategy has fundamentally changed. Diplomatic negotiations, military pressure, economic tools.
Tariffs, asset freezes, supply chain control.
They're no longer separate strategies. They're completely intertwined. You can't talk about peace in Ukraine without discussing the weaponization of trade and frozen assets because they determine the staying power of everyone involved.
And the difficulty in finding a resolution is just immense. This proposed 28-point peace plan, despite involving high-level U.S. and Russian officials, it faces widespread opposition across Europe. Many just see it as an unacceptable capitulation for Kyiv.
Right.
That widespread rejection suggests the road ahead for any lasting settlement will be long and arduous and highly conditional on which economic weapons get deployed next.
And this all builds on that central theme we highlighted. The decades-old system of reliable global supply chains is breaking down, and trade is now formalized as a weapon.
Wielded by major powers.
If that is the new reality, and the sources strongly suggest it is, what does a well-functioning World Trade Organization even look like? Can the necessary reforms to global trade architecture be implemented quickly enough to matter for the future of free and stable commerce? That is the profound question you have to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
A question that really defines the stability of the next decade.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.